The jungle steamed with oppressive humidity as Major General Alexander Archer Vandegrift crouched behind a fallen mahogany tree, watching Japanese construction crews through his field glasses. It was August 7, 1942, and the fate of the Pacific War hung in the balance on this remote island in the Solomon Chain. The enemy had been building an airfield here for months, a strategic position that would allow them to cut Allied supply lines to Australia and New Zealand like a sword through silk. "Sir, the landing craft are in position," whispered Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Austin Edson, his voice barely audible above the drone of insects and distant machinery. The 1st Marine Division had achieved complete surprise in their dawn assault on Guadalcanal, but Vandegrift knew this initial success was merely the calm before an inevitable storm. The Marines had swept ashore with methodical precision, overwhelming the small Japanese garrison of construction workers and Korean laborers who fled into the dense jungle. Within hours, they had secured the partially completed airfield, which they promptly renamed Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at the Battle of Midway. According to contemporary military dispatches from the Pacific Theater Command, this represented the first major Allied offensive operation against Japanese-held territory. But as Vandegrift surveyed the primitive landing strip, he understood the terrible mathematics of their situation. His 19,000 Marines were now stranded on a hostile island, 1,500 miles from the nearest Allied base. Japanese naval and air forces controlled the surrounding waters, and Imperial Army reinforcements would soon arrive in overwhelming numbers. The enemy had been caught off guard once. They would not make that mistake again. The sound of approaching aircraft engines echoed across the humid landscape. Vandegrift's radioman pressed his headset closer, then looked up with grim satisfaction. "Sir, our Wildcats are inbound. 1st Squadron from the escort carriers." As the stubby Grumman fighters roared overhead, their shadows racing across the red earth and green canopy, Japanese bombers appeared on the horizon like deadly birds of prey. The Battle of Guadalcanal had truly begun, and both sides understood that control of this seemingly insignificant speck of jungle and coral would determine whether Japan's empire continued its expansion or began its long retreat. The Marines dug in as the first bombs began to fall, their entrenching tools striking the hard-packed earth with rhythmic desperation. Each man knew they were participants in something larger than themselves, a test of national will that would echo through history. The Japanese had never been pushed back from territory they had claimed. The Americans had never sustained a major ground offensive in the Pacific. One of these precedents would be shattered in the coming months. Vandegrift watched his men work with quiet pride, knowing that many would not survive the campaign ahead. But they would prove something vital to both friend and enemy, that American resolve, once fully committed, was in force that could move mountains or take islands from the most determined foe on earth. Captain Tamaichi Hara stood on the bridge of the destroyer Shiger, watching the dark waters of what the Americans would soon call Iron Bottom Sound. It was August 8, 1942, barely 24 hours since the enemy Marines had landed, and already the Imperial Navy was racing south to crush this audacious invasion. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikako commanded 8 cruisers and 1 destroyer in this night attack force. Their mission clear and brutal: destroy the Allied fleet protecting the beachhead. The Japanese warships moved through the tropical night like phantoms, their crews trained to perfection in night combat techniques that had made the Imperial Navy legendary. Mikawa had studied every report from his reconnaissance aircraft, memorizing the positions of Allied cruisers and destroyers anchored off Guadalcanal and nearby Tulagi. The enemy appeared overconfident, their formations spread thin, and their radar watch inadequate. "Contact bearing 090, whispered the lookout, his night-adapted eyes superior to any electronic device. Through the darkness, the silhouettes of Allied heavy cruisers became visible sitting ducks in the phosphorescent wake of their own anchors. Admiral Mikau raised his hand, then dropped it sharply. "Commence attack." The Battle of Savo Island erupted with devastating fury. Japanese torpedoes, launched from maximum range with deadly accuracy, struck the Australian cruiser Canberra first. The ship's hull split open like an overripe fruit, spilling burning oil across the black water. The American cruiser Astoria followed moments later, her superstructure shredded by precise 8-inch gunfire that turned steel into scrap metal and sailors into casualties. Lieutenant Commander William Greenman, aboard the destroyer Patterson, had only seconds to transmit his warning. "Warning, warning. Strange ships entering harbor." But the message came too late for most of the Allied fleet. The heavy cruiser Quincy took a direct hit to her bridge, killing her captain instantly and leaving the massive warship dead in the water, her guns silent and her crew fighting hopeless fires, according to naval intelligence reports compiled after the battle. The Japanese achieved one of the most complete tactical victories in naval history, sinking 4 Allied heavy cruisers while suffering only minor damage to their own ships. But Admiral Mikawa made a crucial strategic error. He withdrew without attacking the vulnerable transport ships that were still unloading supplies for the Marines ashore. As dawn broke over the carnage-strewn waters, the surviving Allied vessels counted their dead and assessed the damage. Over 1,000 sailors had been killed in less than an hour of combat, their ships now joining the growing underwater graveyard that would give Iron Bottom Sound its ominous name. But the Marine beachhead remained intact, and the vital supplies continued flowing ashore. Major General Vandegrift received the battle report with characteristic stoicism, understanding immediately that his Marines were now truly isolated. The Navy had suffered a crushing defeat, and Japanese reinforcements would soon arrive in overwhelming numbers. But the airfield was nearly operational, and American resolve had been tested in fire and found unbreakable. The first phase of the Guadalcanal campaign had ended with a Japanese tactical victory that paradoxically strengthened American strategic determination. Both sides now understood that this island would become the crucible where the Pacific War's ultimate outcome would be forged. Colonel Kiyonao Ikiki stepped from the landing craft onto the black sand beach of Guadalcanal, his samurai sword gleaming in the moonlight of August 18, 1942. Behind him, 900 elite soldiers of the 28th Infantry Regiment prepared their weapons with ceremonial precision. They had been told the American Marines were poorly trained and demoralized, a few hundred stragglers who would flee at the first sight of Japanese steel. The intelligence was catastrophically wrong. Ikiki had built his reputation destroying Chinese armies with lightning attacks that combined traditional Japanese fighting spirit with modern infantry tactics. His regiment had never known defeat, and he planned to add the recapture of Guadalcanal to his list of victories with a single night assault across the Elu River. The Americans called it Alligator Creek, but names mattered little to warriors who served the Emperor with absolute devotion. "The enemy cannot withstand our bayonet charge," Ikiki declared to his assembled officers, their faces painted with black camouflage paint. "We will drive them into the sea before dawn." His confidence reflected the prevailing Japanese belief that American soldiers lacked the spiritual strength necessary for close combat against Imperial forces. But Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock of the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, had been expecting this attack for days. His men had constructed interlocking fields of fire along the riverbank, with machine gun positions sighted to catch any assault force in deadly crossfire. The Marines had learned hard lessons in their first weeks on Guadalcanal. The enemy was brave, skilled, and utterly ruthless. The Japanese attack began at 1:30 in the morning with a banzai charge that epitomized both the strength and weakness of Imperial Army tactics. Ikiki's soldiers advanced with terrifying courage, their battle cries echoing across the humid jungle as they splashed through the shallow water. But courage alone could not overcome properly positioned automatic weapons and pre-registered artillery. Marine Machine gunners opened fire with disciplined volleys that cut down the advancing Japanese like wheat before a scythe. The Browning automatic rifles chattered continuously, their crews working with mechanical efficiency to maintain devastating rates of fire. According to after-action reports filed with Marine Corps headquarters, the battle became a methodical slaughter as wave after wave of Japanese soldiers threw themselves against impregnable defensive positions. Colonel Ichiki watched his regiment disintegrate in less than 2 hours of combat. The few survivors who reached the Marine positions were killed in hand-to-hand fighting that demonstrated American soldiers could match Japanese ferocity when properly led and equipped. By dawn, over 800 of his men lay dead along the riverbank, their bodies testament to the futility of courage without tactical wisdom. The defeated colonel performed seppuku rather than face the shame of reporting his failure to Imperial headquarters. His death marked the first major Japanese ground defeat of the Pacific War, proving that American Marines could not only hold defensive positions, but could destroy elite enemy units with overwhelming firepower and superior tactics. The Battle of the Tenaru River, as it became known to history, sent shockwaves through the Japanese command structure. For the first time, Imperial Army officers began to question whether American resolve might prove stronger than their own fighting spirit. The Marines had passed their first major test, but greater challenges lay ahead in the steaming jungles of Guadalcanal. Major John Lucian Smith adjusted his flight goggles as his Wildcat fighter climbed through the humid air above Henderson Field, the primitive airstrip that had become the most contested piece of real estate in the Pacific. It was August 24, 1942. And the Japanese were launching their most determined effort yet to recapture Guadalcanal through coordinated naval, air, and ground attacks that would test American resolve to its breaking point. Below him, the Cactus Air Force, as the mixed collection of Marine, Navy, and Army pilots, had dubbed themselves prepared for another day of desperate aerial combat. Smith's squadron of 19 Wildcats represented the thin line between the Marines ashore and the overwhelming Japanese forces gathering for a knockout blow. Each pilot understood that losing control of the air meant losing the island, and losing the island meant losing the war. The radar operator's voice crackled through Smith's headset. Bogies inbound. Bearing northwest, altitude 20,000 feet. Count appears to be 50-plus aircraft. The Japanese were coming again, their Betty bombers escorted by the feared Zero fighters that had dominated Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor. But the Zeros had a weakness that American pilots were learning to exploit. They traded armor and fuel capacity for maneuverability, making them vulnerable to disciplined attacks by rugged American fighters. Lieutenant Colonel Harold William Bauer led the 2nd Squadron into the air, his experienced pilots forming up with practiced efficiency despite the primitive conditions at Henderson Field. The airstrip consisted of little more than packed earth and steel matting, surrounded by jungle that concealed Japanese snipers and artillery observers. Every takeoff and landing occurred under enemy fire, turning routine operations into acts of considerable courage. The aerial battle that followed epitomized the grinding nature of the Guadalcanal campaign. Smith's Wildcats climbed to intercept the bombers while Bauer's squadron engaged the Zero escorts in swirling dogfights that stretched across miles of tropical sky. According to combat reports preserved in Marine Corps archives, the Americans shot down 16 Japanese aircraft while losing only 3 of their own. Significant tactical victory that prevented major damage to Henderson Field's facilities. The Japanese responded with their own innovation, the Tokyo Express, high-speed destroyer runs that delivered troops and supplies under cover of darkness while bombarding American positions with naval gunfire. These nighttime raids turned life on Guadalcanal into a hellish routine of daytime air attacks followed by nocturnal naval bombardments that made sleep impossible and morale a precious commodity. Major Smith led his pilots in the methodical work of intercepting these destroyer runs, their Wildcats carrying makeshift bombs fashioned from aviation fuel tanks. The attacks rarely sank Japanese warships, but they forced the enemy to complete their missions hastily and retreat before dawn, limiting the effectiveness of their supply operations. The strain of continuous combat began showing on both sides. American pilots flew multiple missions daily in aircraft, patched with whatever materials could be found, while Japanese aircrews faced increasingly dangerous flights through skies dominated by alert American fighters. Both air forces were bleeding experienced pilots faster than replacements could arrive, turning every engagement into a war of attrition that neither side could sustain indefinitely. As September approached, Henderson Field remained in American hands, but barely. The Cactus Air Force had proven that Japanese air superiority was not absolute, giving the Marines a sure hope that they might survive the next phase of the campaign. The real test lay ahead, as both sides prepared for battles that would determine whether American determination could overcome Japanese desperation. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Austin Edson crouched in his foxhole as Japanese artillery shells screamed overhead, their explosions illuminating the jungle with hellish flashes of orange and red. It was September 12, 1942, and the Japanese were launching their most determined ground assault yet. Coordinated attack by over 3,000 elite troops aimed at breaking through Marine defenses and recapturing Henderson Field. The ridgeline south of the airfield had become the focal point of Japanese planning, a natural avenue of approach that offered concealment until the final assault phase. Major General Kyotai Kawaguchi had spent weeks infiltrating his forces through the jungle, avoiding American patrols while positioning his troops for what he believed would be the decisive battle of the Guadalcanal campaign. Edson's 1st Raider Battalion held the most critical section of the defensive line, their positions dug into the coral and clay soil with entrenching tools that had become as precious as ammunition. The Raiders were elite Marines trained in commando tactics and night fighting, but they faced overwhelming odds against an enemy renowned for ferocious night attacks that had shattered Chinese and British forces throughout Asia. "Here they come," whispered Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza, a Solomon Islands native who had escaped Japanese captivity, to warn the Marines of the impending assault. His body bore the wounds of prolonged torture, but his spirit remained unbroken, a living symbol of the Allied determination that Japanese commanders consistently underestimated. The Japanese attack began with a barrage that turned the jungle into a landscape from hell. Mortar shells and artillery rounds exploded among the Marine positions with methodical precision, followed by coordinated infantry assaults from multiple directions. Kawaguchi's plan called for simultaneous attacks that would overwhelm American defensive fire and create gaps for follow-up forces to exploit. But Edson had anticipated this strategy, positioning his raiders in depth with interlocking fields of fire that channeled Japanese attacks into predetermined killing zones. The Marines had learned valuable lessons from previous battles, understanding that courage and firepower meant nothing without proper defensive positioning and discipline under pressure. The first wave of Japanese infantry struck the Marine positions. With traditional banzai tactics, their officers leading from the front with drawn swords, while enlisted men followed with bayonets fixed and battle cries echoing through the night. According to detailed combat reports filed with Marine Corps headquarters, the attackers advanced with suicidal courage that impressed even their enemies, but courage could not overcome properly positioned automatic weapons and pre-registered artillery support. Marine machine gunners fired continuously throughout the night, their weapons overheating from constant use while ammunition runners crawled through the darkness to keep the guns supplied. The Browning automatic rifles chattered in disciplined bursts, their crews working with mechanical efficiency to maintain devastating rates of fire against wave after wave of attacking Japanese soldiers. By dawn, the ridgeline was carpeted with enemy dead, but the Marines had suffered heavy casualties as well. Edson's battalion was reduced to barely 400 effectives, many wounded but still fighting from positions they refused to abandon. The Japanese had been stopped, but barely, and both sides understood that the next attack might succeed where this one had failed. The Battle of Bloody Ridge, as it became known to history, marked the high-water mark of Japanese ground attacks. On Guadalcanal, they had thrown their best troops against prepared American positions and been repulsed with catastrophic losses that could not be easily replaced. The Marines had proven once again that American resolve, properly supported and led, could withstand anything the enemy could deliver. Rear Admiral Daniel Judson Callahan stood on the bridge of the heavy cruiser San Francisco, watching the phosphorescent wake of his task force as it steamed through the darkness toward Guadalcanal. It was November 12, 1942, and Japanese battleships were approaching the island with enough firepower to obliterate Henderson Field and end American resistance once and for all. The intelligence reports were stark and terrifying. Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe commanded 2 battleships, 1 light cruiser, and 14 destroyers in a night bombardment force designed to accomplish what months of air attacks and ground assaults had failed to achieve. The massive 16-inch guns of the battleships Hiei and Kirishima could reduce Henderson Field to rubble in a single night, leaving the Marines defenseless against the overwhelming ground forces gathering for a final assault. Callahan's force was outgunned and outnumbered, consisting of only 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers against superior Japanese firepower and night fighting expertise. But the admiral understood that tactical disadvantages meant nothing when weighed against strategic necessity. Henderson Field had to be protected regardless of cost, because losing the airfield meant losing the entire Solomons campaign. All ships, this is flagship. We are going in to stop them, Callahan announced over the radio, his calm voice belying the desperate nature of their mission. The American ships formed a single column and headed directly toward the approaching Japanese fleet, accepting the tactical disadvantage of inferior positioning in exchange for the element of surprise. The naval battle of Guadalcanal erupted at 1:48 in the morning, with point-blank gunfire that turned the dark waters around Savo Island into a cauldron of fire and steel. Japanese searchlights illuminated American ships with blinding intensity, but the sudden appearance of Callahan's force had disrupted Abe's carefully planned bombardment formation, turning the engagement into a chaotic melee that favored courage over firepower. The destroyer Cushing opened fire first, her 5-inch guns targeting the Japanese flagship with rapid salvos that scored hits on the battleship's superstructure. But the response was devastating. Japanese 14-inch shells obliterated the American destroyer in minutes, her crew vanishing in explosions that could be seen from Henderson Field. Admiral Callahan's flagship took multiple hits from battleship guns, the massive shells ripping through her armor, plating like tissue paper. The admiral himself was killed on his bridge, but his sacrifice accomplished its strategic purpose. The Japanese bombardment force was scattered and forced to retreat without completing their mission against Henderson Field. According to Naval records preserved in the National Archives, both sides suffered catastrophic losses in what became known as the most savage naval engagement in American history. The Americans lost 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, while the Japanese battleship Hiei was so badly damaged that she was scuttled the following day. The tactical result was indecisive, but the strategic outcome was decisive. Henderson Field remained operational. The second night brought Admiral William Frederick Halsey Jr.'s relief force into action, with the battleships Washington and South Dakota engaging their Japanese counterparts in a long-range duel that proved American gunnery and radar fire control had achieved technological superiority. The Japanese battleship Kirishima was sunk after absorbing dozens of 16-inch hits, ending Japanese hopes of destroying the American airfield through naval bombardment. The Naval Battle of Guadalcanal marked the turning point of the Pacific War, proving that American industrial capacity and technological Innovation could overcome initial Japanese advantages in training and tactics. Henderson Field survived, and with it, American hopes of ultimate victory in the Solomon Islands campaign. Major General Alexander Patch watched the last Japanese positions through his field glasses as American and Allied forces prepared for the final assault on Guadalcanal. It was February 1st, 1943, and 6 months of brutal warfare had transformed this remote island into a symbol of national determination that would echo through military history for generations to come. The Japanese had been conducting a masterful fighting withdrawal for weeks. Their rearguard actions, designed to cover the evacuation of surviving troops while inflicting maximum casualties on pursuing Allied forces. Lieutenant General Harakuchi Hyakutake commanded this operation with skill that impressed even his enemies. But both sides understood that the outcome was no longer in doubt. American industrial might and reinforcements had tilted the balance irreversibly. Patch's 14th Corps consisted of over 50,000 American and Allied troops, including fresh Army divisions that brought the campaign to its inevitable conclusion. The Marines who had held Guadalcanal during its darkest hours were finally being relieved, their mission accomplished despite odds that had seemed impossible just months earlier. The statistical evidence told the story of American resolve more clearly than any propaganda could achieve. According to detailed casualty reports compiled by military historians, the Japanese had lost over 30,000 troops killed, wounded, or missing during the campaign, while American losses totaled approximately 7,000 casualties. These numbers represented more than mathematical abstractions. They proved that superior logistics, industrial capacity, and national determination could overcome even the most fanatical enemy resistance. Colonel Ichiki's original assessment of American fighting quality had been catastrophically wrong, but Japanese commanders were slow to learn from their mistakes. Throughout the campaign, they had consistently underestimated American resolve while overestimating their own tactical advantages, leading to a series of piecemeal attacks that were defeated in detail by increasingly confident Allied forces. Final Japanese evacuation, conducted under cover of darkness by high-speed destroyers, rescued barely 13,000 survivors from what had once been a formidable garrison. These hollow-eyed soldiers bore little resemblance to the confident troops who had begun constructing an airfield on Guadalcanal 8 months earlier, their defeat serving as a harbinger of what awaited Japanese forces throughout the Pacific. Henderson Field, the primitive airstrip that had cost so much blood to capture and hold, was now the hub of a major Allied airbase from which bombers and fighters ranged across the Central Pacific, interdicting Japanese supply lines and supporting amphibious operations that would carry the war to the enemy's home islands. The strategic objectives that had seemed so distant during the campaign's desperate early days were now within reach. Major General Vandegrift, who had been promoted and transferred to Washington, received the final victory reports with quiet satisfaction. His Marines had proven something vital to both friend and enemy, that American resolve, once fully committed to a cause, represented an unstoppable force that could overcome any obstacle. The Japanese had discovered this truth at terrible cost, but the lesson would serve Allied forces well in the campaigns ahead. The Guadalcanal campaign ended not with dramatic gestures or ceremonial surrenders, but with the quiet recognition that a fundamental shift had occurred in the Pacific War's momentum. Japanese expansion had been halted and reversed, while American confidence and capability had been proven beyond doubt. The costly campaign had indeed demonstrated U.S. resolve too. Japan's commanders, setting the stage for the island-hopping offensive that would end with victory in Tokyo Bay 3 years later.